The Blackwood Archeological Institute Mystery. A Miss Marple mystery as narrated by Connor. Welcome back to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, and today we find ourselves at the prestigious Blackwood Archeological Institute, housed in a magnificent Victorian mansion overlooking the Thames in Richmond. It's a grey November afternoon in 1962, and the fog rolling off the river seems to wrap the building in an appropriately mysterious shroud. Chapter 1: The Exhibition Opening. Miss Jane Marple had been invited to the opening of a new exhibition titled Treasures of Ancient Mesopotamia, featuring artifacts recently acquired through the Institute's excavations in Iraq. Her great-niece Diana worked as a research assistant at Blackwood, and she'd thought her aunt would appreciate seeing the remarkable collection that had taken years to assemble. As Miss Marple settled into the Institute's oak-paneled Great Hall, now arranged with display cases and scholarly presentations, she surveyed the gathering with her characteristic quiet attention. The late afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across perhaps 40 people, archaeologists, historians, museum curators, wealthy patrons, and distinguished academics. "Such fascinating work they do here," Miss Marple murmured to Diana, adjusting her knitting bag on her lap. But her sharp eyes were already noting the subtle tensions that seemed to permeate the scholarly atmosphere. At the center of attention stood Professor Edmund Blackwood, the Institute's director and heir to the family legacy that had established the institution 3 generations prior. A commanding man in his late 50s with a distinguished beard, he held court among the artifacts, though Miss Marple noticed how his confident demeanor seemed forced, as if he were performing rather than simply presenting. Beside him stood Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the Deputy Director and Head of Middle Eastern Studies, a formidable woman in her 40s whose encyclopedic knowledge was matched only by her sharp tongue. Miss Marple observed how Dr. Thornfield's eyes never quite met Professor Blackwood's when he spoke, and how her corrections to his commentary, while academically precise, carried an undertone of barely concealed frustration. Dr. Thornfield discovered most of these pieces herself, Diana whispered. She spent 15 years in the field while Blackwood stays here managing donors and giving lectures. There's been talk that she should be running the institute. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, watching how Dr. Thornfield's jaw tightened when Professor Blackwood took credit for our successful expeditions. Near a display of cuneiform tablets sat Dr. Alexander Hartwell, the institute's elderly chief archivist. A meticulous scholar in his 70s, he appeared deeply troubled, frequently removing his spectacles to clean them, a nervous habit that seemed to intensify whenever anyone mentioned the recent Iraqi excavations. Beside him stood his protégé, Thomas Webb, a young man whose obvious admiration for his mentor was shadowed by an anxiety that seemed to grow whenever certain artifacts were discussed. The most intriguing figure in the room was Dr. Katerina Volkov, a visiting expert on ancient forgeries from the British Museum. Dark-haired and intense, she moved through the exhibition with the focused attention of someone conducting an investigation rather than attending a social gathering. Miss Marple noticed several people watching Dr. Volkov nervously, particularly when she examined certain pieces with her magnifying glass. Mrs. Vivian Blackwood, Edmund's elderly mother and the Institute's primary benefactor, sat regally in a wingback chair near the main display. Though well into her 80s, her eyes remained sharp, and Miss Marple detected something calculating in how she observed the interactions between the various scholars and staff. As Professor Blackwood began his formal presentation about the significance of Mesopotamian civilization, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a tense exchange near the archive entrance. Dr. Hartwell had approached Dr. Volkov with what appeared to be an urgent concern, though their voices were too low to overhear. Whatever he said caused Dr. Volkov's expression to grow grave, and she responded with questions that seemed to distress the elderly archivist considerably. The crown jewel of our collection, Professor Blackwood was announcing, gesturing toward an elaborate golden cylinder seal, represents not merely artistic achievement but a crucial link to understanding ancient Babylonian commercial practices. The provenance of this piece has been thoroughly documented, and its authenticity is beyond question. Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Volkov's expression grew particularly skeptical at this proclamation, while Dr. Hartwell looked as though he might be ill. The presentation concluded with a toast to the success of the Institute's work, and as the group began to circulate among the displays, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Blackwood. "You must be very proud of your son's achievements," Miss Marple offered gently. "Pride is a complicated emotion when it comes to family legacy," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her voice carrying an unexpected weight. "Sometimes one wonders whether the younger generation truly understands the responsibilities they inherit, or the consequences of cutting corners to achieve recognition." As they moved through the exhibition, Miss Marple was struck by the contrast between the Institute's scholarly reputation and the undercurrents of tension she sensed among its staff. The building itself seemed to whisper of secrets, with its maze of corridors lined with storage rooms, archives, and workspaces where the real business of authentication and research took place away from public view. "We maintain the most rigorous standards of documentation," Professor Blackwood explained to a group of visitors. "Every piece is catalogued, every excavation recorded in detail, every authentication process thoroughly verified. The reputation of the Blackwood Institute depends on our absolute commitment to scholarly integrity." Yet Miss Marple observed how several faces showed discomfort at these assurances, particularly Dr. Hartwell, who seemed to shrink further into himself with each mention of documentation and verification. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the tensions that lay beneath this gathering of distinguished scholars. Her years of observing human nature told her that today's exhibition opening was revealing more than ancient artifacts, it was exposing contemporary secrets, professional rivalries, and moral compromises that were very much alive in the present. The stage was set, though none of them realized it yet, for revelations that would prove far more shocking than any archaeological discovery. Chapter 2: The Suspicious Provenance. As evening approached, most of the opening reception guests had departed, but Miss Marple had accepted Diana's invitation to stay for a private viewing of some pieces not yet ready for public display. As Connor would later discover, this decision would place her at the center of events that would shake the archaeological world and expose crimes far more serious than academic fraud. Professor Blackwood had retreated to his office to handle correspondence with potential donors, while Dr. Thornfield led a small group through the Institute's working archives. Miss Marple, moving slowly with her knitting bag, seemed to drift behind the others, but her keen ears caught every nuance of the conversations taking place around her. "I must insist on examining the excavation records for the Babylon series again," she overheard Dr. Volkov saying to Dr. Hartwell in a corridor lined with climate-controlled storage cabinets. Her tone was professional but carried an unmistakable edge of suspicion. "There are discrepancies in the documentation that require immediate clarification." Dr. Hartwell's response was barely audible, but his distress was obvious. "Please, Katerina, you must understand the delicate position this puts me in. Some records are incomplete due to the political situation in Iraq. Incomplete records, or deliberately falsified ones." Dr. Volkov's voice carried a dangerous quiet. "Because what I'm seeing suggests systematic manipulation of provenance data, and that's not something I can overlook." Miss Marple paused to examine a display of pottery shards, but her attention was entirely focused on the conversation nearby. "You're making very serious accusations," Dr. Hartwell whispered urgently. "The Institute's reputation should be built on truth, not fabricated documentation," Dr. Volkov interrupted. "How many pieces in this collection have suspicious origins? How many discoveries were actually purchases from dealers whose sources cannot be verified?" Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Thomas Webb, who appeared carrying a box of archival materials. Both scholars fell silent immediately, but Miss Marple noticed how the young man's hands trembled slightly when he saw them together. "Dr. Hartwell," Thomas said carefully, "the insurance assessments you requested are ready for review." "Yes, of course," Dr. Hartwell replied, but his usual scholarly composure seemed fractured. "Just put them in my office." As Thomas departed, Miss Marple observed Dr. Volkov studying Dr. Hartwell with an expression that mixed professional disappointment with personal concern. Later, as the small tour group examined some recently acquired tablets in the conservation laboratory, Miss Marple found herself standing next to Mrs. Blackwood near a workstation where several artifacts lay partially cleaned and catalogued. "Such painstaking work," Miss Marple commented, watching a conservator carefully remove centuries of dirt from a carved stone relief. "Indeed," Mrs. Blackwood replied, but her voice carried an odd tension. "Though I sometimes wonder if we're uncovering truth or simply creating more elaborate deceptions. The art world, I'm afraid, has become rather flexible in its relationship with authenticity." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with interest. "How do you mean?" Mrs. Blackwood glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer. "When I was young, archaeology was about discovery and preservation. Now it seems to be about prestige and profit. Museums compete for spectacular exhibitions, collectors pay astronomical prices for pieces with questionable histories, and institutions feel pressure to deliver results that will attract funding. And sometimes that pressure leads to compromises." Miss Marple suggested gently. "Sometimes it leads to far worse than compromises," Mrs. Blackwood replied darkly. "Sometimes it leads to crimes that destroy not only careers but lives." Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices from Dr. Thornfield's office down the corridor. Though the words were indistinct, the tone was clearly one of heated argument. Miss Marple noticed several people in the laboratory exchange worried glances. As if summoned by the disturbance, Professor Blackwood appeared in the laboratory doorway, his face flushed and his earlier composure completely gone. "I'm afraid we'll need to cut the evening short," he announced with forced cheerfulness. "Some urgent matters have arisen that require immediate attention." But as the group began to gather their things, Miss Marple observed Dr. Volkov approaching Professor Blackwood with a determined expression. "We need to discuss the authentication reports," she said quietly but firmly. "Tonight." Professor Blackwood's face went pale. "Surely that can wait until morning." "I'm afraid it cannot," Dr. Volkov replied. "Not when the evidence suggests systematic fraud involving pieces worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. The British Museum's board will expect a full report by tomorrow." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Miss Marple noticed Dr. Hartwell gripping the edge of a workbench as if to steady himself, while Thomas Webb looked as though he might faint. "Perhaps," Miss Marple interjected with her characteristic gentle tone, "it would be wise for all parties to take time to review the relevant materials carefully before drawing any conclusions. In my experience, misunderstandings in matters of documentation can often be resolved through patient examination." Dr. Volkov looked at her with surprise, then consideration. "You may be right, Miss Marple. Jane Marple. I'm Diana's great-aunt." "Miss Marple raises a valid point," Professor Blackwood said quickly, seizing the opportunity. "Perhaps we should all meet first thing tomorrow morning when we can examine everything systematically." Dr. Volkov nodded reluctantly. "Very well. But I want all authentication files, excavation records, and insurance documentation ready for review at 9 o'clock sharp." As the group finally dispersed into the foggy Richmond evening, Miss Marple found herself deeply troubled by what she had observed. The Blackwood Institute was clearly harboring secrets that went far beyond academic rivalry or professional jealousy. Someone among this distinguished group was involved in serious criminal activity, and Dr. Volkov's investigation was threatening to expose truths that certain people would go to great lengths to keep hidden. The warning signs were all there for those who knew how to read them, and Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning to recognize when ordinary human weaknesses were about to explode into extraordinary crimes. Chapter 3: Death Among Ancient Treasures. The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, with a kind of persistent London rain that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Miss Marple had spent a restless night at Diana's small flat, her mind turning over the tensions and undercurrents she had observed at the Blackwood Institute. Something about the previous evening's confrontations had left her with a growing sense of unease. Diana had left early for her work at the Institute, and Miss Marple had decided to take a morning walk along the Thames before joining her great-niece for lunch. But as she approached the Victorian mansion that housed the Archaeological Institute around 10 o'clock, she noticed something unusual: police cars parked outside, their presence disrupting the normally quiet scholarly atmosphere of the neighborhood. "Miss Marple!" Diana's voice called out from the Institute's entrance. The young woman hurried toward her, face pale with shock. "Oh, Aunt Jane, something terrible has happened." Before Miss Marple could respond, she found herself being ushered through the familiar corridors, now bustling with police constables and officials. The oak-paneled halls that had seemed so dignified the evening before now felt ominous and threatening. "It's Dr. Volkov," Diana whispered as they walked. "She's been found dead in the archive room." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning's dampness. "When was she discovered?" "About an hour ago. Thomas Webb found her when he came in early to prepare the documentation she had requested. She's been there all night, apparently." They reached the main corridor where several people had gathered, the same faces Miss Marple had observed the previous evening, now marked by shock and barely concealed anxiety. Professor Blackwood stood speaking with a police inspector, his distinguished composure completely shattered. Dr. Thornfield sat in a chair nearby, her usual sharp intelligence replaced by stunned disbelief. Dr. Hartwell appeared to have aged a decade overnight, while Thomas Webb stood apart from the others, still visibly shaken from his gruesome discovery. Mrs. Blackwood, despite her advanced age, seemed the most composed of the group, though Miss Marple noticed her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her walking stick. The police inspector, a competent-looking man in his 40s, was asking questions about the previous evening's events. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe and listen without appearing intrusive. "Dr. Volkov was here to examine certain artifacts and their documentation," Professor Blackwood was explaining. She was a respected expert from the British Museum, specializing in authentication and the detection of forgeries. "And she was working alone in the archive room?" the inspector inquired. "That was her preference," Dr. Thornfield interjected. "Katerina was very methodical. She liked to work without interruption when she was conducting detailed examinations." Miss Marple noticed the slight emphasis Dr. Thornfield placed on certain words, as if she were choosing them very carefully. "The door was locked when Mr. Webb found her this morning," the inspector continued. "Who has keys to the archive?" "Several people," Professor Blackwood admitted reluctantly. "Myself, Dr. Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell as chief archivist, and Thomas as his assistant. The cleaning staff also have access, though they work under supervision." "And Dr. Volkov had been given a key for her investigation?" "Temporarily, yes." Miss Marple observed the faces around her as this exchange took place. Dr. Hartwell seemed particularly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Thomas Webb looked as though he might be sick, while Dr. Thornfield maintained a carefully neutral expression that somehow seemed more revealing than obvious distress would have been. "Initial examination suggests she suffered a heart attack," the inspector was saying. "However, given the circumstances and the nature of her work here, we'll be conducting a thorough investigation." At the mention of a heart attack, Miss Marple saw several people exchange quick glances. There was something about their reactions that struck her as odd, not relief that the death might be natural, but rather a kind of guilty knowledge that suggested they understood more about the circumstances than they were revealing. "She seemed perfectly healthy yesterday evening," Dr. Thornfield observed. "Though she was clearly under some stress about her findings." "What sort of findings?" the inspector asked. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before Professor Blackwood answered. "Dr. Volkov had raised some questions about the documentation of certain pieces in our collection. Academic disputes, you understand. Nothing that would normally cause such extreme stress." But Miss Marple had seen the heated exchanges the previous evening, and she doubted that Dr. Volkov's concerns were merely academic. The woman had spoken of systematic fraud and deliberate falsification, accusations that could destroy careers and result in criminal charges. As the police continued their preliminary investigation, Miss Marple found herself drawn to the archive room where the tragedy had occurred. The corridor leading to it was now cordoned off, but she could see through the open doorway to where Dr. Volkov's body had been found among scattered papers and open filing cabinets. She was looking through the Mesopotamian collection files. She overheard one constable tell another. Papers everywhere, as if she'd been searching for something specific. Thomas Webb, who was standing nearby, seemed to overhear this comment as well. His face went even paler, and Miss Marple noticed him glancing toward Dr. Hartwell with an expression of barely contained panic. "The poor woman," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly, appearing beside Miss Marple. To die alone in that dusty room, surrounded by the remnants of ancient civilizations. There's something almost poetic about it, though terribly sad. Yes, Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. Though I can't help wondering what she might have discovered among those papers that was important enough to keep her working through the night. Mrs. Blackwood's sharp eyes studied Miss Marple's face. "You think her death might not have been entirely natural?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Dr. Volkov was a woman who had uncovered something that made certain people very uncomfortable. And in my experience, when people become desperate to protect their secrets, tragedy often follows." As the morning progressed and the police began conducting individual interviews, Miss Marple found herself more convinced than ever that Dr. Katerina Volkov's death was not the simple heart attack it appeared to be. The distinguished scholars of the Blackwood Institute were hiding something far more serious than academic fraud, and someone among them had been willing to commit murder to keep those secrets buried. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 4: Missing Files and Hidden Motives. Inspector Gerald Morrison of the Richmond Police proved to be a methodical man who, despite his initial assumption that Dr. Volkov's death was from natural causes, was thorough enough to recognize when circumstances demanded deeper investigation. As Connor would later observe, this attention to detail would prove crucial in unraveling the complex web of deception that had been spun within the halls of the Blackwood Institute. Miss Marple, having been present at the previous evening's reception, found herself asked to remain for questioning along with the Institute staff. She positioned herself in the main library where she could observe the comings and goings as Inspector Morrison conducted his interviews in Professor Blackwood's office. Most irregular, having a death in the archives, she overheard Dr. Hartwell muttering to Thomas Webb. The elderly archivist seemed to have aged another decade since the morning's discovery, his usually precise movements now shaky and uncertain. "Dr. Hartwell," Thomas whispered urgently, "about those files Dr. Volkov was examining." "Not here," Dr. Hartwell cut him off sharply, glancing around nervously. "We'll discuss it later." Miss Marple made a mental note of this exchange while appearing to concentrate on her knitting. The first person Inspector Morrison interviewed was Professor Blackwood himself, a conversation that lasted nearly an hour. When the professor emerged, his face was flushed and his earlier shock had been replaced by what appeared to be barely controlled anger. Dr. Thornfield was called in next, and Miss Marple observed that she carried a folder of papers with her. Through the office's partially open door, she could hear fragments of the conversation. Dr. Volkov had raised concerns about several pieces, Dr. Thornfield was saying. She believed some of the provenance documentation might be incomplete. Incomplete or falsified. Inspector Morrison's voice was sharp. "I couldn't say definitively." That's what she was attempting to determine. When Dr. Thornfield emerged 20 minutes later, she appeared composed but was gripping her folder so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dr. Hartwell was the third to be interviewed, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were trembling visibly as he entered the office. She could hear very little of his conversation with the inspector, as he spoke in such low tones that his voice was barely audible even to someone listening intently. However, when he emerged, he looked directly at Thomas Webb with an expression that Miss Marple could only describe as desperately apologetic. The young man seemed to understand the look's meaning, because his face went pale and he began fidgeting with his papers. Thomas Webb's interview was the most interesting from Miss Marple's perspective, primarily because of what happened when it ended. The young man practically fled from the office, and Miss Marple observed him hurrying toward the archive area, despite the fact that it was still cordoned off by police tape. "Excuse me," she heard a constable call out. "You can't go in there, sir." "I just need to check on something," Thomas replied, his voice high with stress. "Some important documents that might be missing." This exchange caught Inspector Morrison's attention, and he emerged from his office to investigate the disturbance. "What documents, Mr. Webb?" the inspector asked. Thomas seemed to realize he had made an error. I was concerned that some of our insurance files might have been disturbed when Dr. Volkov when she was working." "Insurance files?" Inspector Morrison's tone suggested professional interest. "What sort of insurance?" "For the collection. The artifacts. We maintain detailed records for insurance purposes, and if anything were missing or damaged." His explanation trailed off unconvincingly. Miss Marple noticed that Professor Blackwood and Dr. Thornfield had both appeared in the corridor during this exchange, and their expressions suggested they were not pleased with Thomas Webb's impromptu explanation. It was at this point that Inspector Morrison made a decision that would prove significant. "I think we need to examine the archive room more thoroughly," he announced. "And I want a complete inventory of what Dr. Volkov was examining when she died." The next hour proved illuminating. The archive room was a treasure trove of documentation, filing cabinets filled with excavation records, authentication reports, insurance valuations, and correspondence with dealers and other institutions. Dr. Volkov had clearly been conducting a systematic examination of the Institute's most recent acquisitions, particularly those from their Iraqi expeditions. She'd pulled files on about 20 different pieces, Constable Williams reported to Inspector Morrison. All high-value items acquired within the last 2 years. She'd made extensive notes, and it looks like she was cross-referencing the documentation with external sources. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to observe from the doorway due to her status as a witness, noticed that Dr. Volkov's notes contained several question marks and what appeared to be calculations of market values. More significantly, there were several gaps in the filing system where folders should have been but were missing entirely. "Dr. Hartwell," Inspector Morrison called out. "Can you explain why there are missing files in the Mesopotamian collection series?" The elderly archivist looked stricken. Some files may have been misfiled, or perhaps removed for updating." "By whom?" "I would need to check our sign-out records." But when the sign-out records were consulted, they showed no recent activity for the missing files. It was at this point that Mrs. Blackwood, who had been observing the proceedings with sharp interest, made a comment that would prove prophetic. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might want to examine not just what papers Dr. Volkov was looking at, but what papers someone might have removed before you arrived this morning." The implication was clear and disturbing. If files had been deliberately removed after Dr. Volkov's death, it suggested that someone had been in the archive room before Thomas Webb made his discovery, someone who had taken pains to conceal evidence of whatever the deceased woman had uncovered. Inspector Morrison's expression grew considerably grimmer. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled group, "I'm afraid this investigation will be more extensive than initially anticipated. Dr. Volkov's death is now being treated as suspicious, and I'll need all of you to remain available for further questioning." Miss Marple observed the various reactions to this announcement with great interest. Professor Blackwood looked genuinely shocked, Dr. Thornfield appeared grimly unsurprised, Dr. Hartwell seemed on the verge of collapse, and Thomas Webb had gone so pale that Miss Marple wondered if he might faint. Only Mrs. Blackwood seemed unsurprised by this development, which made Miss Marple wonder exactly how much the elderly woman knew about the secrets her family's institute had been harboring. The preliminary investigation had revealed enough inconsistencies and suspicious circumstances to justify Inspector Morrison's concerns, but Miss Marple suspected they had only begun to scratch the surface of the deception and crime that lay beneath the Blackwood Institute's scholarly reputation. Chapter 5: A Web of Academic Betrayal. Over the following 2 days, Inspector Morrison's investigation began to uncover the complex web of relationships and hidden connections that lay beneath the Institute's distinguished facade. Miss Marple, who had remained in Richmond at Diana's invitation to help sort things out, found herself uniquely positioned to observe the human drama that was unfolding alongside the official investigation. The post-mortem results had confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. Dr. Volkov had died from cardiac arrest induced by a rare South American plant alkaloid, hardly the sort of substance one would encounter accidentally in an archaeological archive. The investigation was now officially a murder inquiry. Miss Marple was taking her morning tea in the Institute's small staff kitchen when she overheard a revealing conversation between Diana and another research assistant, Patricia Coleman. "I still can't believe someone would murder Dr. Volkov," Patricia was saying. "She was so dedicated to her work, so ethical about everything." "That might have been exactly the problem," Diana replied quietly. "Diana had mentioned to me that Dr. Volkov had been asking very pointed questions about some of our recent acquisitions." "What sort of questions?" Diana glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, not noticing Miss Marple reading quietly in the corner. "About provenance. About whether certain pieces might have been illegally exported from Iraq. She'd been corresponding with colleagues in Baghdad and had discovered some disturbing discrepancies." Miss Marple absorbed this information while appearing absorbed in her book. Illegal exportation of artifacts was a serious matter that could destroy the Institute's reputation and result in criminal charges for those involved. Later that morning, Inspector Morrison asked Miss Marple to join him for an informal discussion about her observations from the reception evening. "You have a reputation for noticing things others might miss," he said as they walked through the Institute's gardens. "What did you make of the dynamics between our various suspects?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully. "There were several layers of tension, Inspector. Some of it was professional rivalry. Dr. Thornfield clearly felt she should be running the Institute instead of Professor Blackwood. But there was something deeper involving Dr. Hartwell and his assistant, Thomas Webb. They seemed genuinely frightened of what Dr. Volkov might discover. Frightened enough to kill her? Perhaps. Though I suspect the person most directly threatened by her investigation might not be the person who actually committed the murder." Inspector Morrison looked at her with interest. "What do you mean by that?" "In my experience," Miss Marple explained, "people rarely commit murder to protect someone else's secrets unless they have their own compelling reasons. Whoever killed Dr. Volkov was acting to protect themselves, but the evidence suggests the fraud she was investigating involved multiple people." This theory proved prescient when Inspector Morrison's team uncovered the first major breakthrough in their investigation of the Institute's records. Hidden in Thomas Webb's desk, they found a folder containing correspondence between Dr. Hartwell and several antiquities dealers in Damascus and Beirut, correspondence that revealed a systematic scheme to purchase artifacts of questionable legality and create false documentation to legitimize them for the Institute's collection. The scheme was more sophisticated than simple forgery. Dr. Hartwell, with his reputation and expertise, would authenticate pieces that dealers claimed had been discovered in legitimate excavations. Thomas Webb would create supporting documentation, including false excavation reports and export permits. The artifacts would then be purchased by the Institute at below-market prices, with the understanding that some of the savings would be shared with Dr. Hartwell through consulting fees paid to a company he had established. But the investigation revealed an even more disturbing dimension to the fraud. Several of the artifacts in question appeared to have been looted from archaeological sites that had been damaged during political unrest in Iraq. This wasn't merely academic fraud, it was cultural theft on an international scale. Dr. Volkov had discovered the pattern, Inspector Morrison explained to Miss Marple. Her notes show she had identified at least 15 pieces in the Institute's collection that she believed were illegally obtained. She had been preparing a report for both the British Museum and the Iraqi Department of Antiquities. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And such a report would have destroyed more than just Dr. Hartwell's career. It would have implicated everyone who had knowledge of the scheme. The web of complicity was indeed broader than initially suspected. Further investigation revealed that Professor Blackwood had been aware of irregularities in the documentation but had chosen to overlook them because the acquisitions had enhanced the Institute's reputation and attracted significant donor interest. Dr. Thornfield had suspected the truth but had said nothing because she hoped to use the knowledge to force Professor Blackwood's resignation and secure her own appointment as director. Even Thomas Webb's involvement was more complex than simple assistance to Dr. Hartwell. The young man had been systematically skimming money from the fraudulent transactions, using his access to the Institute's financial records to cover his tracks. But as Inspector Morrison began to piece together the scope of the conspiracy, Miss Marple found herself troubled by a nagging inconsistency. The poison that had killed Dr. Volkov was sophisticated and exotic, not the sort of substance that would be readily available to any of the obvious suspects. Moreover, the method of administration suggested someone with specialized knowledge of chemistry or pharmacology. "Inspector," she said during one of their conversations, "have you considered that the person who actually committed the murder might not be one of the people directly involved in the artifact fraud?" "You think someone else was involved?" "I think someone else was being protected. Someone whose involvement in this scheme would have been even more damaging than what we've discovered so far." As if to confirm her suspicions, that afternoon brought a startling development. Mrs. Blackwood requested a private meeting with Inspector Morrison, and what she revealed would transform the entire investigation. "I'm afraid my family's involvement in this matter goes deeper than you realize," she told him in her study, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia spanning 3 generations of the Blackwood Institute's history. The artifacts that Dr. Volkov was investigating, some of them were not purchased through dealers at all. They were acquired through much more direct methods, and by someone who had both the connections and the expertise to obtain rare poisons from South America. Inspector Morrison leaned forward with intense interest. "Who are you referring to, Mrs. Blackwood?" "My nephew, Dr. Richard Blackwood. Edmund's cousin. He's been leading our Iraqi expeditions for the past 3 years, and I'm afraid he's been systematically looting sites and smuggling artifacts back to England. Dr. Hartwell's documentation fraud was merely the cover story for a much more serious criminal enterprise." The revelation explained much that had puzzled Miss Marple about the case. Dr. Richard Blackwood was a botanist by training who had turned to archaeology later in his career. His knowledge of exotic plants would have given him access to the poison that killed Dr. Volkov, and his position leading the Iraqi expeditions would have made him the person most directly threatened by her investigation. But as Inspector Morrison prepared to issue a warrant for Dr. Richard Blackwood's arrest, Miss Marple realized there was still one crucial element missing from their understanding of the case, the specific evidence that had led Dr. Volkov to focus her investigation on the pieces that would have exposed the entire conspiracy. That evidence, she suspected, was hidden somewhere in the Institute, and finding it would be the key to ensuring that justice was served not just for Dr. Volkov's murder, but for the broader crimes that had motivated it. Chapter 6: The Poison in the Teacup. The search for Dr. Richard Blackwood proved fruitless. The man had apparently vanished from his London residence the morning after Dr. Volkov's body was discovered. Inspector Morrison had issued alerts to all ports and airports, but Miss Marple suspected that someone with Richard's experience in international travel and questionable border crossings would not be easily captured through conventional means. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of the archive room where Dr. Volkov had died was yielding fascinating results. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Morrison and the police forensics team as they conducted a meticulous examination of the scene, her keen eye for detail proving invaluable in interpreting the physical evidence. The poison was administered through her tea, Constable Williams reported, holding up the delicate china cup that had been found beside Dr. Volkov's body. Laboratory analysis confirms traces of the alkaloid concentrated in the residue at the bottom of the cup. Miss Marple examined the cup carefully. It was part of the Institute's standard tea service, identical to dozens of others used throughout the building. Was there a teapot found in the room? No, Miss Marple. Just the single cup. This struck her as significant. So someone brought Dr. Volkov a cup of tea while she was working. That suggests either a colleague making a friendly gesture, or someone with a specific reason to ensure she consumed the poison. Inspector Morrison nodded. We found fingerprints on the cup belonging to Dr. Volkov herself, but they're overlaid on other prints that have been partially wiped clean. Someone made an effort to obscure their identity. The forensics team had also discovered something else of great interest. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near Dr. Volkov's desk was a small leather portfolio containing photographs and detailed notes that she had apparently concealed there during her investigation. She suspected she was in danger, Miss Marple observed as they examined the hidden portfolio. These notes are much more comprehensive than anything found in her official papers. The concealed documentation painted a damning picture of the conspiracy. Dr. Volkov had not only identified the fraudulent artifacts but had traced their origins to specific archaeological sites in Iraq. More significantly, she had discovered evidence that several pieces in the Institute's collection were artifacts that had been reported stolen from the Iraqi National Museum during the political upheavals of the previous year. "This changes everything," Inspector Morrison said grimly. "We're not just dealing with authentication fraud, we're looking at international trafficking in stolen cultural treasures." The portfolio also contained something that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken, a detailed analysis of the Institute's financial records showing systematic discrepancies in the accounts related to the Iraqi expeditions. Dr. Volkov had discovered that significantly more money had been allocated to the expeditions than had been officially reported, with the difference being channeled through a complex web of consulting fees and equipment purchases. She was following the money trail, Miss Marple murmured, studying the carefully annotated financial documents. And she had identified who was profiting from the scheme. But the most revealing piece of evidence was a letter Dr. Volkov had drafted but apparently never sent. Addressed to the director of the British Museum, it outlined her findings and included a specific request for protection, stating that she believed her investigation had placed her in personal danger. "I have reason to believe that my inquiries have been reported to certain parties who have a vested interest in preventing the truth from being revealed," Inspector Morrison read aloud. "I am particularly concerned about the reaction of Dr. Richard Blackwood, who has made several attempts to discourage my investigation through both professional pressure and what I can only describe as veiled threats." The letter was dated 3 days before Dr. Volkov's death, confirming that she had been aware of the danger she faced. As the forensics team continued their examination, they made another discovery that would prove crucial to understanding how the murder had been carried out. In the archive room's small adjoining storage closet, they found a syringe hidden behind a box of archival supplies. The syringe contains traces of the same alkaloid that killed Dr. Volkov, the forensics expert reported. But here's the interesting part: the poison wasn't injected. The syringe was used to introduce the substance into something else. Miss Marple examined the syringe carefully. Into her tea, perhaps? Someone could have used this to inject the poison into a cup of tea, ensuring the exact dosage and avoiding any risk of accidental exposure. This discovery supported her growing theory about how the murder had been committed. The killer had prepared the poison tea elsewhere in the building, then brought it to Dr. Volkov in the archive room. The use of a syringe suggested both premeditation and access to medical or scientific equipment. "We need to examine every laboratory and storage area in this building," Inspector Morrison decided. Whoever did this had access to both the poison and the equipment needed to administer it. The search of the Institute's various work areas proved illuminating. In the conservation laboratory, they found evidence that someone had been working there late in the evening, coffee cups, papers, and equipment left out in a way that suggested hurried departure. More significantly, they discovered that the laboratory's chemical storage cabinet had been accessed recently, with several compounds signed out but not returned. Dr. Thornfield, who supervised the conservation laboratory, was notably defensive when questioned about the missing chemicals. "We often have researchers working late," she explained. "The conservation work requires precise timing, and sometimes people need to work outside normal hours to complete certain processes." "Who has access to the chemical storage?" Inspector Morrison asked. "Several people. Myself, the conservation staff, and any researcher who has signed the safety protocols. Including Dr. Richard Blackwood." Dr. Thornfield hesitated before answering. "Richard has used the laboratory facilities for his botanical research. He's particularly knowledgeable about plant-based compounds and their preservation." Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Thornfield seemed to be choosing her words very carefully, as if she knew more than she was revealing but was reluctant to implicate her colleague directly. The investigation of the conservation laboratory also revealed something that had initially been overlooked: a detailed logbook recording everyone who had accessed the building outside normal hours. The entries for the night of Dr. Volkov's death showed that 3 people had used their security codes to enter the building after 6 p.m., Dr. Volkov herself at 6:30, Dr. Richard Blackwood at 8:45, and someone identified only by the initials MB at 10:15. MB. Inspector Morrison mused. Who would that be? Miss Marple studied the logbook entry. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone elderly or under stress. What about Mrs. Blackwood? Her first name is Vivian, but perhaps she has a middle name beginning with M. When they approached Mrs. Blackwood about the security log, her reaction was telling. Instead of denying her presence at the Institute that night, she seemed almost relieved to finally discuss it. "Yes, I was there," she admitted. "I couldn't sleep, and I was worried about what Katerina's investigation might reveal. I wanted to speak with her privately, to see if there was some way to resolve the situation without destroying the Institute's reputation." "And did you speak with her?" Mrs. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. "I found her in the archive room, but she was already gone. I was too frightened to raise an alarm immediately. I thought people might suspect me, given my family's involvement in the situation." This revelation added another layer of complexity to the timeline of events. Mrs. Blackwood claimed to have discovered Dr. Volkov's body around 10:30 p.m., several hours before Thomas Webb's official discovery the next morning. Her failure to report the death immediately had potentially compromised the crime scene and allowed crucial evidence to be removed or altered. But Miss Marple suspected there was more to Mrs. Blackwood's late-night visit than a simple desire for a private conversation. The elderly woman's intimate knowledge of the Institute's operations and her family's long history with the institution suggested she might possess information that could prove crucial to solving the case. The physical evidence was painting a clearer picture of the crime, but Miss Marple realized that understanding the full scope of the conspiracy would require delving deeper into the complex relationships and hidden motivations that had made murder seem like the only solution to someone's desperate circumstances. Chapter 7: Following the Blood Money Trail. Inspector Morrison's investigation now expanded beyond the immediate circle of Institute staff to examine the broader network of dealers, collectors, and international contacts that had facilitated the artifact trafficking scheme. Miss Marple found herself drawn into this wider investigation when the inspector asked for her assistance in interviewing some of the more elderly and potentially fragile witnesses whose cooperation would be essential to building a comprehensive case. Their first stop was the London offices of Harrington and Associates, a prestigious firm of art and antiquities appraisers who had provided authentication services for several of the Institute's recent acquisitions. Mr. Geoffrey Harrington, the firm's elderly founder, received them in his Mayfair office surrounded by museum-quality pieces that spoke of decades of expertise in the field. "Dr. Volkov had contacted me about a week before her death," Mr. Harrington revealed, his voice heavy with regret. "She was asking very specific questions about pieces we had authenticated for the Blackwood Institute, particularly regarding the technical aspects of our documentation process." Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Harrington seemed genuinely distressed by Dr. Volkov's death, suggesting his relationship with her had been based on mutual professional respect rather than commercial convenience. "What sort of technical questions?" Inspector Morrison inquired. "She was interested in our photographic records, our chemical analysis reports, that sort of thing. She seemed to suspect that some of our authentication documents might have been altered after we had provided them to the Institute." This was a significant revelation. If authentication documents had been tampered with after being issued by reputable experts, it suggested a level of sophistication in the fraud that went beyond simple forgery. "Did you provide her with copies of your original records?" Miss Marple asked. "I did indeed." She was a respected colleague, and her concerns were obviously serious. "I gave her complete files for 6 different pieces, including all our original photographs and test results." Inspector Morrison made careful notes. "Do you still have copies of those files?" "Naturally." "Would you like to examine them?" The comparison between Mr. Harrington's original records and the versions held in the Institute's files revealed systematic alterations. Photographs had been replaced, test results had been modified, and in some cases entire sections of documentation had been rewritten to support false provenance claims. This level of document forgery would require considerable expertise, Mr. Harrington observed. Someone with access to professional photography equipment, chemical analysis capabilities, and intimate knowledge of authentication procedures. Miss Marple found this information particularly intriguing when combined with what they had learned about the Institute's staff. Dr. Richard Blackwood would have had access to all these capabilities through his expedition work, she observed to Inspector Morrison as they left Mr. Harrington's office. But the actual execution of such detailed forgeries would require considerable time and specialized equipment. Their next interview was with Dr. Sarah Whitfield, a curator at the British Museum who had worked closely with Dr. Volkov on several international repatriation cases. Dr. Whitfield met them at the museum's conservation laboratories, where the sophisticated equipment needed for detailed artifact analysis was readily apparent. Katerina was brilliant at detecting forgeries and questionable documentation, Dr. Whitfield told them. But she was also very careful about making accusations. If she was raising concerns about the Blackwood Institute's collection, she would have had absolute proof of wrongdoing. She mentioned that Dr. Volkov had been working on a major case involving stolen artifacts, Miss Marple said. Was that related to her investigation of the Institute? Dr. Whitfield nodded gravely. We had received information from colleagues in Baghdad about a significant number of artifacts that had gone missing from various sites and museums. Katerina was working with Interpol to trace these pieces, and several items in the Blackwood collection match descriptions of stolen artifacts. This revelation elevated the case from academic fraud to international art theft, with implications that extended far beyond the Institute itself. The stolen pieces Katerina had identified were worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, Dr. Whitfield continued. But more importantly, they represented irreplaceable cultural heritage. The people involved in trafficking them weren't just committing fraud, they were participating in the destruction of Iraq's historical legacy. Inspector Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as the scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. Dr. Whitfield, in your professional opinion, how many people would need to be involved in an operation of this scale? At minimum, you'd need someone with access to the sites where artifacts were being stolen, someone with expertise in authentication and documentation, someone with connections to the international art market, and someone with the financial resources to fund the operation. We're talking about a sophisticated criminal network, not just a few opportunistic academics. As they returned to Richmond, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the expanding web of criminality they had uncovered. The murder of Dr. Volkov was beginning to seem less like an isolated act of desperation and more like a calculated move to protect a lucrative criminal enterprise. Their investigation took another significant turn when they received a call from Customs and Excise. Officials at Heathrow Airport had intercepted a shipment of artifacts being exported to a private collector in Switzerland. The paperwork identified the consignor as Dr. Richard Blackwood, but the documentation appeared to be fraudulent. The pieces in this shipment match several items on Interpol's list of stolen Iraqi artifacts, the customs official explained when they met at the airport's secure holding facility. We estimate the total value at over £2 million. Miss Marple examined the intercepted artifacts with growing fascination. These were not the sort of pieces that would typically be found through legitimate archaeological excavation, they were museum-quality objects that had clearly been removed from established collections or significant archaeological sites. The paperwork claims these pieces were excavated during the Institute's recent expedition, Inspector Morrison noted. But according to their official reports, no artifacts of this quality or significance were discovered. The customs seizure provided crucial evidence linking Dr. Richard Blackwood directly to the trafficking operation, but it also raised new questions about the scope of the conspiracy. The logistics of smuggling such valuable artifacts out of Iraq and through British customs would have required considerable planning and resources. Someone has been financing this operation on a significant scale, Miss Marple observed. The question is whether Dr. Richard Blackwood was the mastermind or simply a well-placed accomplice. Their answer came from an unexpected source. That evening, Thomas Webb contacted Inspector Morrison requesting an urgent meeting. The young man appeared haggard and frightened when they met him at a quiet pub in Richmond, away from the Institute and its atmosphere of suspicion. I can't keep silent anymore, he told them. Dr. Volkov's death has made me realize how serious this situation has become. I need to tell you the truth about what's been happening at the Institute. What Thomas revealed over the next hour transformed their understanding of the case entirely. The artifact trafficking operation was indeed extensive and well-funded, but its true architect was not Dr. Richard Blackwood. Richard was just the front man, Thomas explained. He had the archaeological credentials and the connections in Iraq, but he wasn't smart enough to organize something this complex. The real mastermind is someone much closer to home, someone who's been using the Institute as a cover for international art trafficking for years. Miss Marple leaned forward with intense interest. "Who are you referring to, Thomas?" The young man's hands trembled as he reached for his drink. "Dr. Thornfield. She's been running the entire operation from the beginning. Richard, Dr. Hartwell, myself, we were all just tools in her scheme. And when Dr. Volkov got too close to the truth, Dr. Thornfield decided she had to be eliminated." The revelation that Dr. Margaret Thornfield was the true architect of the criminal conspiracy cast the entire case in a new light. Her position as deputy director, her expertise in Middle Eastern archaeology, and her access to all aspects of the Institute's operations would have made her ideally placed to orchestrate such a sophisticated operation. But Miss Marple realized that accusing someone of Dr. Thornfield's stature and reputation would require more than Thomas Webb's testimony. They would need concrete evidence linking her directly to both the trafficking operation and Dr. Volkov's murder. The expanded investigation had revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise, but the most dangerous phase of their inquiry was just beginning. Chapter 8: Forged Papers and Deadly Plans. The revelation that Dr. Margaret Thornfield was the suspected mastermind behind the artifact trafficking operation required Inspector Morrison to approach the next phase of his investigation with extreme caution. A woman of Dr. Thornfield's academic stature and professional connections could not be accused without overwhelming evidence, and Miss Marple suspected that someone intelligent enough to orchestrate such a complex criminal scheme would have taken considerable pains to protect herself from exposure. Thomas Wegg's decision to cooperate with the investigation proved crucial in understanding how the documentary fraud had been executed. In a series of detailed interviews, he provided Inspector Morrison with a comprehensive picture of the sophisticated methods used to create false authentication records and conceal the true origins of stolen artifacts. Dr. Thornfield had access to everything, Thomas explained during one of their sessions at the police station. As deputy director, she could review and modify any documentation before it went into the official files. She also had connections with appraisers, customs officials, and dealers throughout Europe and the Middle East. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to observe these interviews, was struck by the methodical nature of the fraud Thomas described. How did she manage to coordinate all these different elements without arousing suspicion? She was brilliant at compartmentalizing information, Thomas replied. Dr. Hartwell thought he was just helping to smooth over some minor documentation irregularities. Richard Blackwood believed he was participating in legitimate archaeological acquisitions with slightly flexible export procedures. I thought I was simply helping to organize financial records. None of us understood the full scope of what she was doing until it was too late to back out. The picture that emerged was of Dr. Thornfield as a master manipulator who had used her colleagues' minor ethical compromises and financial vulnerabilities to draw them into increasingly serious criminal activity. Once they were implicated, their fear of exposure had ensured their continued cooperation. She had something on all of us, Thomas continued. Dr. Hartwell's gambling debts, Richard's tax problems, my own personal difficulties. She helped us solve these problems in exchange for our assistance, but she also made sure we were too compromised to expose her. Inspector Morrison's team had begun a thorough examination of the Institute's financial records, and the patterns they discovered supported Thomas Webb's account. Over the past 3 years, there had been a systematic diversion of funds from legitimate archaeological projects to support what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. The genius of her scheme, Inspector Morrison explained to Miss Marple, was that she used the Institute's legitimate activities as cover for her criminal enterprise. Real archaeological expeditions provided cover for trafficking operations. Authentic artifacts were mixed with stolen pieces to make the entire collection appear legitimate, and the Institute's reputation gave credibility to fraudulent documentation. But while the financial evidence supported the existence of a criminal conspiracy, proving Dr. Thornfield's direct involvement in Dr. Volkov's murder required more specific evidence. The breakthrough came when the police forensics team made a discovery in Dr. Thornfield's office that she had apparently overlooked in her efforts to conceal her involvement. Hidden in her personal safe, which had been opened under court order, they found a collection of documents that revealed the full extent of her criminal activities. Among these papers was a folder labeled Insurance Valuations that contained correspondence with several major collectors and dealers, offering specific artifacts for private sale at prices far below their actual market value. She was essentially operating a sophisticated fencing operation, Inspector Morrison explained. Stolen artifacts would be processed through the Institute's collection, given false authentication, and then quietly sold to private collectors who didn't ask too many questions about provenance. More significantly, the safe contained a detailed dossier on Dr. Volkov's investigation, including copies of the emails she had sent to colleagues in Baghdad and London, transcripts of her telephone conversations with other experts, and even photographs of her hidden notes that had apparently been taken secretly while she was working in the archive room. Dr. Thornfield had been monitoring Dr. Volkov's investigation for weeks, Miss Marple observed as she examined the surveillance materials. She knew exactly what evidence Dr. Volkov had uncovered and how close she was to exposing the entire operation. But the most damning piece of evidence was a handwritten note in Dr. Thornfield's distinctive handwriting that appeared to be planning notes for the murder itself. The note contained references to neutralizing the threat, creating natural-looking circumstances, and ensuring no traceable evidence. The note also contained specific details about Dr. Volkov's working habits, including her preference for working late in the archive room and her habit of drinking tea while she worked. These details suggested that Dr. Thornfield had been observing her intended victim carefully and planning the murder well in advance. This level of premeditation makes the case much more serious, Inspector Morrison noted. We're not dealing with a crime of passion or a desperate attempt to silence someone who had stumbled onto the truth. This was a calculated execution designed to eliminate a specific threat to a profitable criminal enterprise. The documentary evidence also revealed the sophisticated methods Dr. Thornfield had used to obtain the exotic poison that killed Dr. Volkov. Among her papers was correspondence with a botanical supplier in South America, ostensibly for research purposes, that included specific inquiries about the availability and effects of various plant alkaloids. She used her academic credentials to obtain substances that would have been impossible for an ordinary person to acquire, Miss Marple realized. Her expertise in archaeological chemistry gave her both the knowledge to select an appropriate poison and the credibility to purchase it without arousing suspicion. The final piece of the documentary puzzle came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Blackwood contacted Inspector Morrison to report that she had found additional papers in her late husband's study that she believed might be relevant to the investigation. Among these papers was a letter that Dr. Thornfield had written to the elder Mr. Blackwood shortly before his death the previous year. In the letter, she had outlined her concerns about irregularities in the Institute's recent acquisitions and had requested his authorization to take necessary steps to protect the Institute's reputation. She was positioning herself as the person trying to clean up the problems, Miss Marple realized as she read the letter. Even then, she was creating documentation that would support her version of events if the truth ever came to light. But the letter also contained information that would prove crucial to understanding Dr. Thornfield's ultimate motive for murder. She had written that Dr. Volkov's investigation posed a threat not just to individual careers but to the very existence of the Institute itself. If these allegations become public, Miss Marple read aloud, the resulting scandal will destroy everything your family has built over 3 generations. The Institute will lose its funding, its reputation, and its ability to continue its vital work. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made to protect the greater good. The documentary evidence painted a clear picture of Dr. Thornfield as a criminal mastermind who had used her position and expertise to orchestrate a sophisticated international trafficking operation. But Miss Marple realized that proving her guilt in a court of law would require more than documents. They needed to demonstrate exactly how she had committed the murder and why her methods made her the only person who could have carried it out. The next phase of the investigation would focus on the technical aspects of the crime itself. Chapter 9: The Perfect Murder Technique. The technical analysis of Dr. Volkov's murder proved to be the most complex aspect of Inspector Morrison's investigation, requiring expertise from toxicologists, forensic chemists, and botanical specialists. Miss Marple found herself fascinated by the scientific puzzle that the case presented, particularly the question of how the exotic poison had been administered with such precision and why the killer had chosen such an unusual method. Dr. Patricia Henley, the Home Office toxicologist who had conducted the analysis of Dr. Volkov's remains, provided the first crucial insight into the technical aspects of the murder. She met with Inspector Morrison and Miss Marple in her laboratory at Scotland Yard, where the sophisticated equipment used for chemical analysis created an atmosphere of scientific precision that seemed appropriate for unraveling such a methodical crime. The poison that killed Dr. Volkov was derived from Chondrodendron tomentosum, a South American vine, Dr. Henley explained, gesturing to charts and molecular diagrams spread across her desk. The active alkaloid, tubocurarine, is extremely potent and was historically used by indigenous peoples to create arrow poisons for hunting. Miss Marple studied the scientific documentation with great interest. How difficult would it be for someone to obtain and prepare such a substance? That's what makes this case so unusual, Dr. Henley replied. Tubocurarine is not something you can simply purchase or extract without considerable expertise. The preparation process requires specialized knowledge of plant chemistry, access to proper extraction equipment, and understanding of dosage calculations. We're talking about someone with genuine scientific training. Inspector Morrison leaned forward. Could someone with Dr. Thornfield's background have acquired this knowledge? Absolutely. Her academic record shows she has extensive training in archaeological chemistry, including the analysis of ancient dyes, preservatives, and other organic compounds. She would have had both the theoretical knowledge and practical experience necessary to extract and purify this particular alkaloid. But the technical analysis revealed something even more significant about the method of murder. The concentration of poison found in Dr. Volkov's system was precisely calculated to ensure death within a specific timeframe while minimizing the victim's ability to call for help. The dosage was expertly calibrated, Dr. Henley continued. Too little, and Dr. Volkov might have survived long enough to identify her attacker. Too much, and the death would have occurred so quickly that it might have appeared obviously unnatural. The killer demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both the poison's effects and the victim's probable response. Miss Marple found this level of technical precision particularly telling. This suggests someone who was not only knowledgeable about chemistry but also familiar with Dr. Volkov's physical condition and likely reactions. The forensic analysis of the teacup found beside Dr. Volkov's body provided additional technical evidence about how the murder had been carried out. Using advanced chromatography techniques, the laboratory had determined that the poison had been introduced into the tea through a precise injection method that left minimal trace evidence. The killer used a very fine-gauge needle to inject the poison directly into the prepared tea, Dr. Henley explained, showing them microscopic photographs of the evidence. This method would have required steady hands, knowledge of injection techniques, and access to medical-grade equipment. Inspector Morrison consulted his notes. We found a syringe hidden in the archive room's storage closet. Could that have been the injection device? The needle gauge and residue analysis are consistent with that theory, Dr. Henley confirmed. But here's the interesting part, the injection was made through the teacup's handle, in a location where the puncture mark would be virtually invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. This technical detail provided crucial insight into the killer's methodology. The precision required to inject poison through a porcelain teacup without creating obvious damage demonstrated both considerable skill and careful planning. Miss Marple examined the forensic photographs with growing fascination. The killer would have needed to practice this technique, she realized. No one could achieve this level of precision on their first attempt. Their investigation of this possibility led to a breakthrough discovery. A search of Dr. Thornfield's home laboratory, conducted under warrant, revealed evidence that she had indeed been practicing the injection technique. Hidden in her garage workshop, investigators found several broken teacups that showed evidence of multiple needle punctures, along with syringes and chemical residues consistent with the poison used to kill Dr. Volkov. She had been perfecting her method for weeks, Inspector Morrison noted grimly. This wasn't a desperate improvisation, it was a carefully rehearsed execution. The technical evidence also revealed how Dr. Thornfield had managed to administer the poison tea without arousing suspicion. Analysis of the Institute's security cameras showed that she had visited the archive room twice on the night of the murder, once to deliver the tea to Dr. Volkov, and again later to retrieve the teacup and dispose of evidence. Her position as deputy director gave her unrestricted access to all areas of the building, Inspector Morrison explained. She could move freely without arousing suspicion, and her presence in the archive room would have seemed perfectly natural to Dr. Volkov. But the most sophisticated aspect of Dr. Thornfield's method was how she had disguised the timing of the murder. The poison she had chosen was not immediately fatal but created a delayed reaction that would allow her to establish an alibi for the actual time of death. Dr. Henley's analysis showed that Dr. Volkov had consumed the poison tea around 9 p.m. but had not died until approximately 10:45 p.m. During this crucial window, Dr. Thornfield had been attending a faculty meeting in another part of London, creating what appeared to be an unshakable alibi. She calculated that Dr. Volkov would be found the next morning, and the time of death would be estimated based on the body's condition rather than precise toxicological analysis, Miss Marple realized. If we hadn't investigated so thoroughly, the delayed action nature of the poison might never have been discovered. The technical evidence also explained why Dr. Thornfield had chosen such an exotic poison despite the risks involved in obtaining it. Common poisons would have been detected immediately during autopsy, but tubocurarine required specialized analysis that might not have been conducted if the death had initially appeared to be from natural causes. She was counting on the poison being overlooked, Inspector Morrison concluded. If Mrs. Blackwood hadn't shared her suspicions about the circumstances of Dr. Volkov's death, we might never have ordered the detailed toxicological analysis that detected the alkaloid. The scientific analysis had revealed not only how the murder had been committed but also demonstrated the extraordinary level of planning and expertise that Dr. Thornfield had brought to the crime. Her background in archaeology, chemistry, and research had provided her with all the knowledge necessary to design and execute what she had intended to be the perfect murder. But as Miss Marple reflected on the technical evidence, she realized that Dr. Thornfield's very expertise had also created the evidence that would ultimately convict her. The precision and sophistication of her method pointed so clearly to someone with her specific combination of skills and knowledge that no other explanation was credible. The scientific puzzle had been solved, but one crucial element remained: confronting Dr. Thornfield with the evidence and securing a confession that would provide complete closure to the case. Chapter 10: Unmasking the Scholar's Dark Heart. The morning of Dr. Margaret Thornfield's arrest dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of sharp winter sunlight that seemed to cut through the fog of deception that had shrouded the Blackwood Institute for so many months. Inspector Morrison had decided to conduct the arrest at the institute itself, both to ensure that all relevant evidence could be secured immediately and to provide closure for the staff and community that had been devastated by the crimes. Miss Marple accompanied the police team, having been asked by Inspector Morrison to assist in what he anticipated would be a complex interrogation. Dr. Thornfield's intelligence and academic training made her a formidable opponent, and the inspector valued Miss Marple's insights into human psychology and her ability to recognize when someone was concealing crucial information. They found Dr. Thornfield in her office, apparently preparing for a normal day's work despite the intensive investigation that had been conducted around her. She looked up from her papers with what appeared to be genuine surprise when Inspector Morrison entered with the arrest warrant. "Dr. Thornfield," Inspector Morrison said formally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Dr. Katerina Volkov and for conspiracy to traffic in stolen cultural artifacts. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." Dr. Thornfield's reaction was remarkable for its composure. Rather than protesting her innocence or demanding explanations, she simply nodded slowly and began organizing the papers on her desk as if she had been expecting this moment. "I assume you have evidence to support these charges," she said calmly. "May I finish securing these research materials before we proceed? Some of them are irreplaceable historical documents." Miss Marple observed this response with great interest. Even facing arrest for murder, Dr. Thornfield's primary concern appeared to be protecting scholarly materials, a reaction that seemed genuine and consistent with her academic character, yet somehow jarring given the circumstances. The formal interrogation took place at Richmond Police Station, where Dr. Thornfield was provided with legal representation before Inspector Morrison began his systematic presentation of the evidence. Miss Marple was permitted to observe from an adjacent room, watching through a one-way mirror as the confrontation unfolded. Inspector Morrison began with the financial evidence, presenting the complex paper trail that demonstrated the scope of the artifact trafficking operation. Dr. Thornfield listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points, but showing no apparent distress at the revelations. The documentary evidence shows systematic fraud extending over at least 3 years, Inspector Morrison stated. Stolen artifacts worth millions of pounds were processed through the Institute's collection, given false authentication, and sold to private collectors. Your position as Deputy Director gave you access to all the systems and relationships necessary to coordinate this operation. Dr. Thornfield considered this presentation carefully before responding. Inspector, I don't dispute that such activities took place at the Institute. Indeed, I had become aware of irregularities and was in the process of investigating them myself. However, I think you may have misidentified the person responsible for organizing these crimes. This unexpected response caused Inspector Morrison to pause. Miss Marple leaned forward with intense interest, recognizing the tone of someone who was about to reveal information that would dramatically alter their understanding of the case. Are you claiming that someone else was responsible for the trafficking operation? Inspector Morrison asked. I'm saying that your investigation has been thorough and accurate in identifying what happened, but incomplete in understanding who made it happen and why, Dr. Thornfield replied. The person who designed and controlled this criminal enterprise is someone you haven't fully investigated because you assumed they were merely a victim of circumstances rather than an active participant. Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition as she realized what Dr. Thornfield was implying. There had been one person connected to the case whose involvement they had never questioned, someone whose position and knowledge would have made them ideally placed to orchestrate the entire conspiracy. Mrs. Vivian Blackwood, Dr. Thornfield continued. The Institute's primary benefactor, the person with ultimate authority over all acquisitions and financial decisions, and someone with connections throughout the international art world that span more than 50 years. The revelation was so unexpected that Inspector Morrison was momentarily speechless. Mrs. Blackwood had presented herself as a concerned elderly woman trying to protect her family's legacy, but Dr. Thornfield was suggesting she had actually been the criminal mastermind behind the entire operation. That's a very serious accusation, Inspector Morrison said carefully. Do you have evidence to support this claim? Dr. Thornfield smiled grimly. I have been collecting evidence for months, Inspector. You see, I discovered Mrs. Blackwood's criminal activities quite by accident when I was researching the Institute's historical acquisitions for a scholarly paper. I found discrepancies in documentation dating back nearly 20 years, long before any of the current staff were involved. Miss Marple watched with fascination as Dr. Thornfield began to present her own version of events. If this account were true, it would mean their entire investigation had been misdirected from the beginning. Mrs. Blackwood has been using the Institute as a front for art trafficking since the 1940s, Dr. Thornfield continued. Her late husband was aware of some of her activities but chose to look the other way because the profits were funding the Institute's legitimate research. When he died, she became even more brazen. And Dr. Volkov discovered this. Dr. Volkov discovered the recent Iraqi artifacts, but she hadn't yet traced the pattern back to its true source. However, Mrs. Blackwood realized that a thorough investigation would inevitably expose decades of criminal activity. She decided that Dr. Volkov had to be eliminated. Inspector Morrison leaned forward intently. Are you claiming that Mrs. Blackwood committed the murder? I'm claiming that she ordered it, Dr. Thornfield replied. Mrs. Blackwood has arthritis and limited mobility. She couldn't have carried out the technical aspects of the murder herself. But she had the knowledge to plan it and the leverage to ensure it was executed. Leverage over whom? Dr. Thornfield's expression became pained. Over me, Inspector. Mrs. Blackwood had discovered that I had been involved with Richard Blackwood. Not just professionally, but personally. She threatened to destroy both our careers and expose details of our relationship that would have been professionally devastating. This revelation added an entirely new dimension to the case. If Dr. Thornfield had been romantically involved with Dr. Richard Blackwood, it explained both her knowledge of his activities and her vulnerability to blackmail. She forced you to commit the murder? Inspector Morrison asked. She presented it as the only way to protect everyone involved, Dr. Thornfield said, her composure finally beginning to crack. She said that Dr. Volkov's investigation would destroy the Institute, ruin multiple careers, and result in criminal charges for everyone who had been involved, however peripherally, in the trafficking operation. Miss Marple observed the woman's body language carefully. Dr. Thornfield appeared to be telling the truth about her coercion, but there were still elements of her story that didn't align with the evidence. Dr. Thornfield, Inspector Morrison said, "We found evidence that you had been planning the murder for weeks. The practice teacups, the correspondence about poisons, the surveillance of Dr. Volkov, all of this suggests premeditation on your part, not coercion." Dr. Thornfield was silent for a long moment before responding. "Mrs. Blackwood is extremely thorough in her planning, Inspector. She insisted that if we were going to act, it had to be done professionally, with no risk of discovery. She provided the resources and guidance for the technical aspects of the murder, including the poison." Mrs. Blackwood has an extensive network of contacts from decades in the art world. Obtaining exotic substances through academic channels was well within her capabilities. As Dr. Thornfield continued her account, a complex picture emerged of an elderly criminal mastermind who had used her position, knowledge, and emotional leverage over younger colleagues to maintain and expand a sophisticated trafficking operation. According to this version of events, Dr. Thornfield had been as much a victim as a perpetrator, coerced into murder by someone who held both her career and her personal happiness hostage. But Miss Marple found herself troubled by inconsistencies in Dr. Thornfield's story. While her account of Mrs. Blackwood's long-term criminal activities was plausible, her portrayal of herself as a reluctant accomplice didn't fully align with the evidence they had discovered. Inspector Morrison seemed to share these concerns. "Dr. Thornfield, if Mrs. Blackwood was forcing you to commit murder, why didn't you contact the police? Why didn't you seek help?" "Because I was already too deeply involved," Dr. Thornfield admitted. "My relationship with Richard, my knowledge of the trafficking operation, my own minor participation in documentation irregularities, Mrs. Blackwood made it clear that exposing her would inevitably expose me as well. She convinced me that we were all trapped in the situation together." The interrogation continued for several more hours, with Dr. Thornfield providing detailed information about Mrs. Blackwood's alleged criminal network, her methods of operation, and her long history of using the Institute as a front for illegal activities. If even half of what Dr. Thornfield claimed were true, it would represent one of the longest-running art trafficking operations in British criminal history. But as Miss Marple listened to the testimony, she began to recognize a familiar pattern. Dr. Thornfield was providing just enough truth to make her story credible while carefully positioning herself as a victim rather than a willing participant. Her account explained all the evidence that implicated her while redirecting responsibility to someone else. When the formal interrogation concluded, Inspector Morrison joined Miss Marple in the observation room to discuss their assessment of Dr. Thornfield's revelations. "What do you think?" he asked. "Could Mrs. Blackwood really be the mastermind behind all of this?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully. "Inspector, I think Dr. Thornfield is telling us part of the truth. Mrs. Blackwood may indeed have been involved in art trafficking for many years. Her knowledge, connections, and financial resources would certainly have made it possible. But I don't believe Dr. Thornfield is the reluctant victim she's portraying herself to be." "What makes you say that?" "The technical evidence, Inspector. The precision of the murder method, the sophisticated planning, the expert knowledge of chemistry and dosage calculations, all of this points to someone who was personally invested in ensuring the crime's success. A reluctant accomplice forced into murder would be more likely to make mistakes or leave evidence that would expose the coercion." Inspector Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "So you think they were partners rather than victim and victimizer?" "I think Dr. Thornfield was a willing participant in both the trafficking operation and the murder, but now that she's been caught, she's trying to minimize her responsibility by blaming someone else. The question is whether Mrs. Blackwood was actually involved or whether Dr. Thornfield is simply using her as a convenient scapegoat." Their discussion was interrupted by a knock on the door. A constable entered with an urgent message that would transform their understanding of the case one final time. "Inspector," the constable said, "we've just received word from the hospital. Mrs. Vivian Blackwood has suffered a massive stroke and is not expected to survive. She's been unconscious since early this morning." Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. If Mrs. Blackwood had suffered a stroke that morning, it meant she had been incapacitated during the entire time that Dr. Thornfield had been claiming she was the criminal mastermind. Either Dr. Thornfield's story was a complete fabrication, or there was yet another layer of deception they had not yet uncovered. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think we need to return to the Blackwood Institute immediately. There are still secrets hidden there that we haven't discovered, and I suspect the truth about this case is more complex than either of our theories have suggested." As they prepared to leave the police station, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the intricate web of truth, lies, and misdirection that had characterized this case from the beginning. Dr. Volkov's murder had been the culmination of a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple participants with overlapping motives and shared secrets. Unraveling the complete truth would require one final confrontation with the evidence and the people who had spent so many months concealing it. The game was nearing its end, but Miss Marple suspected the final revelation would prove more surprising than anything they had yet discovered. 2 hours later, Miss Marple stood once again in the oak-paneled library of the Blackwood Institute, but this time the atmosphere was very different from the scholarly elegance of the exhibition opening just days before. Inspector Morrison had assembled all the surviving participants in the case: Professor Edmund Blackwood, Dr. Alexander Hartwell, Thomas Webb, Diana, and several constables who had been involved in the investigation. Dr. Thornfield sat in custody, her earlier composure replaced by obvious anxiety as she realized her final gambit had failed with Mrs. Blackwood's sudden illness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began in her characteristic gentle but authoritative tone, "we have been dealing with a case that involved not just murder, but decades of deception, professional betrayal, and the exploitation of academic trust for criminal gain. The truth, as it often is, proves to be both simpler and more complex than any of us initially understood." She moved slowly around the room, her knitting bag in hand, but her attention entirely focused on the assembled group. Dr. Katerina Volkov died because she had discovered evidence of systematic fraud in this institute's collection, fraud that threatened to expose not just recent crimes, but a pattern of criminal activity extending back many years. What made her particularly dangerous to the conspirators was not just her expertise in detecting forgeries, but her moral courage in pursuing the truth regardless of the personal cost. Inspector Morrison nodded, understanding that Miss Marple was about to provide the comprehensive explanation they needed to close the case definitively. "The artifact trafficking operation was indeed real and extensive," Miss Marple continued. "Stolen pieces from Iraq were being processed through the Institute's collection, given false authentication, and sold to private collectors. But the operation was not controlled by any single mastermind, it was a conspiracy of convenience involving multiple parties with different motives and levels of involvement." She paused beside Professor Blackwood, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. Professor Blackwood knew of irregularities but chose to overlook them because the profits were funding the Institute's legitimate research and enhancing its reputation. Dr. Hartwell participated because his gambling debts made him vulnerable to financial pressure. Thomas Webb became involved because he needed money and saw an opportunity for personal gain. Dr. Richard Blackwood provided the field expertise and international connections necessary to acquire the artifacts. "And Dr. Thornfield?" Inspector Morrison asked. Miss Marple's expression grew more serious. Dr. Thornfield was indeed the operational leader of the conspiracy, but her role was more complex than simple greed or criminal ambition. She genuinely believed that she was protecting the Institute and advancing important archaeological research. In her mind, the illegal acquisition of artifacts was justified if it preserved cultural treasures that might otherwise be lost or destroyed. "That doesn't justify murder," Professor Blackwood said quietly. "No, it does not," Miss Marple agreed. "But it explains why Dr. Thornfield was willing to commit such a desperate act. When Dr. Volkov's investigation threatened to expose the entire operation, Dr. Thornfield convinced herself that eliminating one person was acceptable if it protected the work and reputation of many others. She moved to the window, looking out at the Thames where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The tragedy of this case is that Dr. Thornfield's fears were largely unfounded. A honest acknowledgement of the problems, cooperation with authorities, and genuine reform could have preserved the Institute's core mission while addressing the criminal activity. Instead, a decision to commit murder transformed a case of professional misconduct into a capital crime that has destroyed far more than it protected. Inspector Morrison stepped forward. "What about Mrs. Blackwood's alleged involvement?" Miss Marple turned back to the group with a sad smile. Mrs. Blackwood was indeed aware of irregularities in the Institute's operations, and she may have been more complicit in overlooking questionable acquisitions than she initially admitted. However, Dr. Thornfield's attempt to portray her as the criminal mastermind was simply a desperate effort to redirect blame. The stroke that incapacitated Mrs. Blackwood this morning was brought on by the stress of seeing her family's legacy destroyed by the crimes she had failed to prevent. Thomas Webb, who had been sitting silently throughout Miss Marple's explanation, finally spoke up. "What will happen to the Institute now?" "That will depend on the Board of Trustees and the various governmental agencies involved," Inspector Morrison replied. "But the immediate priority is recovering the stolen artifacts and returning them to their rightful owners in Iraq and elsewhere." Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave. "In my experience," she said gently, "institutions and communities survive crises like this when people have the courage to face the truth honestly and work together to rebuild what has been damaged. The Blackwood Institute has been home to genuine scholarship and important research for many years. Those positive accomplishments need not be destroyed by the crimes of a few individuals." As the group began to disperse, Diana approached her great-aunt with obvious emotion. "Aunt Jane, how did you know that Dr. Thornfield was lying about Mrs. Blackwood?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, I've learned over the years that when someone is caught in a serious crime, their first instinct is often to blame someone who cannot defend themselves. Dr. Thornfield's account of Mrs. Blackwood as a criminal mastermind was simply too convenient, too complete in its explanations, and too perfectly timed to be entirely credible." As they walked together toward the Institute's entrance, Miss Marple reflected on the complex human drama they had witnessed. Dr. Katerina Volkov had died because she had possessed the moral courage to expose uncomfortable truths, while her killer had convinced herself that protecting comfortable lies justified the most serious crime possible. The Blackwood Institute would eventually recover from this scandal, but the lessons of the case would endure. That institutional reputation built on deception is ultimately worthless, that professional expertise without ethical foundation leads to corruption, and that the courage to tell the truth, however painful, is the only real protection against the kind of moral compromise that makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary crimes.